Julian Morris had never thought of himself as someone who would end up at war with the Suburban Homeowners Association. Not because he trusted them or believed in their ideals of neatly trimmed hedges and color-coordinated mailboxes, but because he had always assumed that the little bureaucracies of neighborhood life were background noise, something to be tolerated in exchange for quiet streets and reliable trash pickup. Yet, from the very first month in Riverland, he realized that the people who ran this particular HOA carried themselves not as volunteers concerned with curb appeal, but as if they were stewards of a corporate empire, constantly repeating phrases like community stability and long-term sustainability, while quietly drafting rules that increased dues, restructured voting rights, and made the association less accountable to its residents. He had moved here only 6 months earlier after receiving a lucrative offer from a financial firm that wanted him to audit its compliance department, a job that required long hours in the city but promised a secure salary, and with it came his decision to settle in a neighborhood marketed as environmentally forward, where solar panels dotted rooftops, where electric car charging ports were installed in nearly every driveway, and where glossy brochures promised uninterrupted services thanks to an advanced microgrid system maintained through collective dues. The first time he attended a meeting, he was struck by the tone, because instead of residents chatting about gardening or parking, the board spoke like executives addressing shareholders, with slides detailing cost projections and risk factors. And when Julian asked why maintenance fees had doubled in just 2 years, despite no new infrastructure being built, the president of the board, Laura Brent, gave him a thin smile and explained that such decisions were beyond the scope of an individual resident's comprehension, and that if he had concerns, he should submit them in writing for review. It wasn't hostility exactly, more like the cold patience of people who believed their authority unchallengeable. And though Julian let the matter drop that evening, he filed it away in his mind because as an auditor he recognized the cadence of someone protecting an opaque system. His house itself was modest compared to the sprawling properties in the neighborhood, but it was enough for him. 2 stories of clean lines, a quiet yard that bordered the woods, and an upgraded electrical system that came with the property when the previous owners had modernized. He had never intended to involve himself in the politics of Riverland, yet his very presence seemed to irritate the board. Perhaps it was the way he asked questions others let pass. Perhaps because he was new and had not been broken in by years of compliance, or perhaps because his professional background made him less likely to take vague numbers at face value. What drew his attention most, however, was the way the HOA constantly praised the microgrid system, calling it a fail-safe against blackouts, and boasting that no resident had been left without power in over a decade. They presented this as a triumph of their management, yet the invoices that arrived each quarter suggested a different story. Constant line-item adjustments for preventative infrastructure upgrades, surcharges for special resilience measures, and vague future improvement reserves, none of which were ever described in detail. It was only when he quietly compared invoices with his neighbors that he realized the amounts varied in ways that could not be explained by square footage alone, with some families paying significantly more than others without any pattern. To Julian, this smelled not just of inefficiency but of deliberate manipulation, though he said nothing, biding his time, telling himself that until he had proof, it was better not to stir trouble. In his mind, the HOA was like a patient creditor, always tightening rules and waiting for residents to fall behind so it could impose penalties. And though this was cynical, his instinct rarely betrayed him. The tension in Riverland was not something most residents spoke about openly, yet he noticed the quiet compliance in the way people avoided eye contact when the board circulated memos, or how at meetings questions quickly died under Laura Brent's polite but firm responses. For Julian, accustomed to corporate doublespeak, this environment was unsettlingly familiar, as if he had left the world of financial audits only to find a miniature version of it living next door. He told himself to focus on his job, his house, and the quiet life he had envisioned. But the unease remained, and when the night of the blackout finally came, the irony was almost unbearable, because the association that had bragged for years about perfect reliability suddenly plunged its residents into darkness, and the man who had once dared to question their rising costs would find himself blamed for what would become the most expensive, exhausting, and dangerous ordeal of his life. The blackout struck without warning, and though it lasted less than half an hour, the consequences rippled across Riverland with a force far beyond what the absence of light and electricity should have caused, because in a community built on the promise of resilience and absolute reliability, the very fact that the lights had gone out was treated not as an inconvenience but as a scandal, and within hours the story of who was to blame began to take shape in whispers and emails and thinly veiled accusations that always circled back to one name, Julian Morris. At first he thought it was nothing more than gossip, the reflexive search for a scapegoat after an unexpected disruption. But the morning after, when he found an official envelope on his doorstep embossed with the HOA's crest, the truth unfolded in words so precise and deliberate that he had to reread them several times just to comprehend the weight of what they implied. According to the board, Julian had intentionally tampered with the Riverland microgrid system, causing a cascading failure resulting in personal, financial, and infrastructural damage totaling $1.2 million. And therefore, the HOA was initiating a civil suit against him, holding him personally liable for the outage and all associated losses. It would have been absurd if it were not written in the dry, clinical language of litigation, with line items cataloging damages: spoiled food from non-functioning refrigerators, destroyed electronics allegedly fried by voltage fluctuations, medical costs incurred by a resident whose dialysis machine shut down mid-cycle, even lost revenue for home-based businesses unable to process transactions during the blackout. Every page pulsed with accusation, and though Julian knew he had done nothing, the precision with which the charges were articulated made it clear that this was not a misunderstanding, but a coordinated effort to destroy him. He sat at his kitchen table staring at the numbers, feeling as if the walls of the house he had only just begun to consider home were closing in. And the strangest part was that the entire case rested on the assertion that the blackout had originated from a failure near his property line, a segment of underground cabling mapped as his adjacent easement, which, according to the board's engineers, showed evidence of deliberate interference. He tried to dismiss it as a fabrication, yet doubt crept in when he remembered how, on the night of the outage, his own house had gone dark before the others, almost 40 seconds earlier by his estimation, a detail so minor at the time that he had laughed it off. But now, in the shadow of the accusation, it felt like a piece of evidence being twisted into a noose. The HOA wasted no time fanning the flames. Within 24 hours of the letter, a notice was circulated to all residents warning them of ongoing legal proceedings against a member suspected of compromising community safety. And though Julian's name was not printed, everyone knew who it referred to. Neighbors who had once nodded at him during morning walks now avoided his gaze, and he could sense the silent judgment in the way curtains shifted when he passed, the way conversations ended abruptly when he approached. He called the number listed on the lawsuit to demand clarification, only to be met with the calm, almost patronizing voice of the association's attorney, who told him that the matter was best resolved through settlement, and suggested that he avoid the embarrassment of a drawn-out trial by admitting fault and agreeing to a reduced penalty of $350,000. The suggestion was delivered with such casual confidence that Julian almost laughed, but the attorney's tone made it clear that they were not bluffing, that they had every intention of dragging his name and finances through the courts if he resisted. For Julian, who had built a career in auditing by recognizing patterns in financial statements, the situation reeked of orchestration rather than chance. The inflated damages, the immediate legal action, the eagerness to settle for a smaller amount, all of it suggested not a community seeking restitution but a leadership seeking leverage, as if the blackout were less a crisis than an opportunity. Yet, even as his mind raced to analyze the strategy, his emotions betrayed him, because the pressure was suffocating. He had no family in the state, no network of allies in the neighborhood, and his colleagues at work, though cordial, knew him only superficially and could not be expected to intervene. For the first time in years, he felt the precariousness of being truly alone, targeted not for what he had done but for the fact that he had once dared to question authority. That night, unable to sleep, he walked the perimeter of his property, tracing the path of the underground lines as marked on the neighborhood survey. And when he reached the easement, a strip of grass sloping toward a wooded buffer zone, he stood for a long time staring at nothing, as if the ground itself might yield answers. He saw no signs of tampering, no disturbed soil, no exposed wires, yet the knowledge that someone had placed the blame here gnawed at him, because if the sabotage were real, then someone had stood in this very spot, hidden by darkness, working with tools and precision to trigger a chain reaction. The thought chilled him, less because of the sabotage itself, and more because it meant he was not simply an unlucky scapegoat but part of someone else's design. The following day, as he drove to the city for work, he noticed HOA maintenance vehicles parked near the edge of the community, their crews standing idly by as though waiting for him to pass, and when he returned that evening, the same vehicles were gone. But fresh chalk markings now lined the pavement near his driveway. Arrows and letters he did not understand but which filled him with the distinct sense of being monitored. Every instinct told him the board was building a case, layering physical suggestion atop bureaucratic accusation until even he might begin to question his own memory of events. He considered calling the police, but what could he say? That his neighbors were suing him and drawing symbols on the asphalt. They would dismiss it as civil dispute. What frightened him most was how quickly reality could tilt under the weight of an accusation, how facts ceased to matter when narrative took hold, and by the end of that week, as the HOA scheduled an emergency assembly to address residents' concerns about infrastructure integrity, Julian understood that this was not going to fade with time but escalate, that the $1.2 million claim was not just about money but about control, and that his refusal to submit had turned him from neighbor into enemy in the eyes of those who ruled Riverland. Julian knew that ignoring the lawsuit would only accelerate his downfall, so instead of waiting for the HOA's next move, he began the slow, meticulous work of dissecting every claim made against him, approaching the case as if it were an audit, not of numbers on a spreadsheet, but of narratives, motives, and opportunities. Because in his mind, the key to surviving was not simply to prove his innocence, but to demonstrate the impossibility of the accusation itself. He started with the location of the alleged interference, that easement running along the side of his property, a strip of land he technically did not own but was responsible for maintaining, and which the HOA insisted had been the site of deliberate tampering with the underground lines. According to their report, faint tool marks had been observed on a section of conduit, though the photos he was shown were grainy, poorly lit, and could easily have depicted normal wear. Determined to see for himself, Julian spent a Saturday digging shallow trenches in the area, taking care not to damage anything, but what he found was nothing unusual, just compacted soil, roots, and the sealed casing of the conduit, pristine and untouched. Frustration built in him like static, because the absence of evidence was not enough to clear his name. In fact, he feared it would be spun against him, as if his digging could later be described as an attempt to cover his tracks. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that evidence was irrelevant when perception had already been weaponized, and that realization filled him with a grim determination. If the HOA had chosen him as their target, then he would have to dig deeper than they expected, into the machinery of their governance itself. His first step was to request copies of all financial statements related to the microgrid's maintenance, a right technically available to residents under state law, and though the association was legally obliged to provide them, his request was met. With silence for nearly 2 weeks until finally he received a stack of heavily redacted documents, entire pages obscured by black ink, as if community electricity were a matter of national security. That alone was enough to raise alarms in his auditor's mind, because redaction in financial reports usually signaled concealment of conflicts of interest. He pressed further, filing a formal demand under disclosure provisions, and that was when he noticed the subtle shift in how the community treated him. People who had once ignored him now stared openly when he walked past. Children were pulled back from sidewalks when he approached, and one evening he discovered his trash can overturned and smeared with something foul that stank of deliberate. Humiliation. It was not the vandalism itself that unnerved him, but the silence around it. No neighbor spoke up, no one pretended it was an accident, and the message was clear. He was being isolated socially as well as legally. Yet isolation brought clarity, because in solitude he could focus, and with each night spent poring over what little documentation he had, patterns began to emerge. Contracts awarded to the same maintenance company year after year with no competitive bidding. Sudden spikes in expenditure tied suspiciously to preventive overhauls, and vague notes about infrastructure assessments conducted by third parties whose names did not appear anywhere else in the records. The more he mapped these anomalies, the more the puzzle resembled schemes he had uncovered in corporate audits, where deliberate inefficiencies served as siphons for funds. He was not yet ready to accuse anyone outright, but one name kept recurring: President Laura Brent, who signed every expenditure authorization, whose signature appeared on every report, and who, curiously, had personally certified the inspection of the conduit near his property the day after the blackout. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Determined to confront the matter, Julian attended the emergency assembly called by the HOA, a gathering framed as an opportunity for residents to seek reassurance, though the tone from the start was theatrical. Brent stood at the podium radiating calm authority, explaining that the blackout had been contained, that repairs were underway, and that steps were being taken to address the source of the disruption, her gaze lingering ever so slightly on Julian, as murmurs rippled through the crowd. When he raised his hand to speak, she acknowledged him with a smile so polished it seemed rehearsed, and when he asked why no external inspectors had been called to verify the findings, her expression hardened just enough to reveal the crack beneath. Her poise? She replied that external interference was unnecessary and costly, that the association's engineers were fully capable, and that it was disappointing to see certain members of the community undermining trust during a delicate time. The phrase landed like a verdict, and as heads turned toward him, Julian felt the walls closing in again, yet this time he did not retreat. Instead, he pressed further, asking why invoices showed a sudden 30% rise in maintenance costs in the last quarter, and though Brent quickly moved on to another question, he saw the flicker of unease cross her face. That flicker was enough to confirm his suspicion. The blackout was not a random failure, nor was the lawsuit merely an overreaction. It was cover for something deeper, a scheme built on inflated budgets and hidden expenditures, a scheme that required a distraction to keep residents from asking the questions he was now asking. From that moment, Julian's fear shifted into resolve, because he understood that his role was no longer that of a scapegoat to be crushed quietly, but of a threat to a system designed to prey on complacency. And if he had any chance of survival, it lay in refusing to play the role they had assigned him, in forcing into the open what they had worked so hard to bury. Julian had learned through years of financial auditing that corruption always leaves a paper trail, even if it is faint, fragmented, or disguised as routine bureaucracy, And so, after the assembly where Laura Brent had brushed aside his questions, he became obsessed with finding that trail in Riverland, spending late nights at his dining room table surrounded by piles of printouts, highlighted invoices, scanned statements, and handwritten notes, piecing together what little information the board had reluctantly provided. The more he studied the numbers, the more the patterns revealed themselves, like faint outlines on tracing paper slowly becoming clearer, sudden spikes in maintenance costs that coincided with board elections, line items for urgent system testing that appeared just days before the blackout, and an odd notation in one file referring to a legacy switch node, a term that should have been irrelevant since, according to every public record, the neighborhood's old manual switching equipment had been decommissioned a decade ago. That phrase refused to leave his mind, because it hinted at infrastructure that officially did not exist, but was still somehow being maintained with residents' money. Driven by this detail, Julian visited the county clerk's office during his lunch break from work, requesting property surveys and utility maps for Riverland, documents that were public but rarely requested. As the clerk brought out dusty folders and rolled maps, Julian felt the strange thrill of being on the edge of something significant, the way he had once felt as a young auditor uncovering his first case of embezzlement. When he spread the maps across the table, his eyes fixed on a faint line running beneath the wooded buffer zone near his house, marked with an obsolete symbol for an underground access hatch. The line was annotated as inactive, yet there was no record of its removal, only a note that it was transferred to community jurisdiction. That detail confirmed his suspicion. The old manual switch node had never been dismantled, only hidden on paper. Someone had kept it alive in secret. 2 nights later, unable to resist the pull of the discovery, Julian went out under cover of darkness with a flashlight and a copy of the survey. Following the coordinates, he found himself at the edge of the woods, where half buried under years of soil and vines sat a concrete slab with a rusted hatch, its padlock corroded but intact. His pulse quickened because the very existence of the hatch meant the HOA had lied, not just by omission but deliberately. He did not attempt to break it open. He was not reckless, but he crouched beside it, running his hand over the metal, imagining the cables and levers that must lie beneath, a forgotten skeleton key to the entire neighborhood's power. For the first time, the blackout no longer seemed like a failure of modern technology but the deliberate activation of this archaic switch node, something only someone with access and knowledge could have done. And in Riverland, that meant Brent. The realization filled him with both relief and dread. Relief, because it proved he was not imagining things and that he was not responsible for the outage, but dread, because the existence of the hatch also meant the HOA had engineered a cover-up, comprehensive that even county records were complicit. He understood now that the $1.2 million lawsuit against him was not a clumsy overreach but a smokescreen designed to divert attention from the fact that the outage had been orchestrated from within. To test his theory, Julian filed a subtle request with the county's utilities department, asking whether they had logged any anomalies in Riverland's grid during the blackout. The clerk responded politely that no anomalies were reported, which was impossible if the modern system had truly failed. The absence of records was itself proof that the system had not failed at all. It had been bypassed. Armed with this knowledge, Julian returned to the next board meeting, holding his silence until the floor was opened for questions, and then calmly asked why the financial records included ongoing maintenance payments to contractors listed as servicing archived assets. The room fell quiet as Brent tried to smile, explaining that archived was a clerical category for long-term planning. But Julian pressed on, asking whether residents were aware that they were still funding a manual. Switching nodes supposedly dismantled in 2009. The silence that followed was more telling than any denial. And though Brent quickly adjourned the meeting under the pretext of time, Julian saw the flicker of panic in her eyes, the same flicker he had seen before. In the days that followed, pressure against him intensified. He returned home one evening to find a letter taped to his door warning him that continued harassment of board members could result in criminal charges. A statement so vague it was clearly designed to intimidate rather than inform. His car tires were slashed in his driveway, though when he called the police, they dismissed it as vandalism with no leads. Even at work, whispers began to spread. Someone had called his employer to express concern about his legal troubles, and though his supervisor said it was only a formality, Julian could feel the ground beneath his professional life beginning to crack. But amid the intimidation, there was also progress, because one evening a thick envelope arrived at his house with no return address, containing photocopies of what appeared to be internal emails between board members. The correspondence referenced manual override procedures and mentioned that testing cycles had to be disguised as unexpected outages. One line stood out above all: "Ensure Morris is framed as disruptive. He's already unpopular. Easy scapegoat." Julian's hands shook as he read the words, because they confirmed not only the existence of the hidden node but also the deliberate plan to blame him. Whoever had leaked the documents was taking a risk, and though he could not know their motives, their courage gave him new strength. The real turning point came when Julian compared timestamps from the emails with the timeline of the blackout. The outage had begun at 8:13 p.m., yet one email, time-stamped 7:54, referred to switching procedure initiated. The sequence proved that the blackout was not a spontaneous accident, but a premeditated act. At that moment, Julian knew beyond doubt that the president herself, or someone acting on her orders, had cut the power. He also knew that holding the truth in his hands was only the beginning, because exposing it would mean dragging into the light a conspiracy that involved not just financial manipulation, but the deliberate endangerment of residents for profit. Standing in his living room surrounded by papers and maps, Julian realized that his fight was no longer about clearing his name, but about dismantling the system Brent had built. And though he felt the weight of fear pressing on his chest, he also felt something else he had not felt since before the lawsuit began. Resolve, sharper than any threat they could throw at him, because now he had the key piece of the puzzle, and once it was revealed, the entire edifice of lies would begin to crumble. Julian had always believed that truth, once uncovered, would carry its own weight, that evidence would speak louder than insinuation. Yet the deeper he pushed into the machinations of the Riverland Board, the more he realized that facts alone were fragile things when set against the machinery of organized authority, because every time he tried to introduce clarity, the HOA responded not with counter-arguments but with intimidation, shifting the field of battle away from reason and into the murky terrain of fear. After receiving the anonymous envelope of leaked emails, he thought briefly about going directly to the county commission, but before he could act, the pressure against him escalated with unnerving precision, as though Brent had sensed that someone had broken ranks and was determined to crush him before he could build momentum. It began with small acts of erosion. His mailbox ripped from its post, his internet inexplicably cut for 3 days despite timely payments, a letter from his insurance company informing him that they had been contacted about emerging liability. Concerns each incident alone could have been dismissed as coincidence, but together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore, an invisible hand pushing him closer to collapse. Despite these obstacles, Julian pressed forward, filing a motion with the court demanding independent forensic inspection of the power grid, citing the inconsistencies in the HOA's reports. His attorney, a weary man accustomed to HOA disputes over fences and lawn maintenance, admitted privately that he had never seen such a case. Never a suit this large, never a board so aggressively coordinated, and though he warned Julian that the court might reject the motion as unnecessary, he filed it nonetheless, knowing it was their best chance to expose the hidden switch node. The request triggered immediate retaliation. The HOA issued a formal statement accusing Julian of slandering the integrity of elected community leadership. And a week later he received notice that his lawn, mailbox design, and even exterior paint color were under investigation for compliance violations. It was clear that Brent was using every lever of power to drown him in administrative warfare, 1,000 tiny cuts meant to bleed him dry. The most chilling moment came when he returned home late one evening to find the rusted hatch he had discovered in the woods surrounded by fresh spray paint markings, bright orange arrows pointing directly to it, and a plastic sign staked into the ground reading, HOA infrastructure, do not tamper. The brazenness of the move struck him harder than any anonymous threat, because it was an open declaration that the hidden node had been claimed by the board, retroactively legitimized, as if by simply labeling it they could erase years of lies. He realized then that they were not afraid of exposure. They were confident they could rewrite the narrative faster than he could reveal the truth. As the days passed, his isolation grew. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid him, and at the grocery store he overheard fragments of whispered conversations, parents blaming him for endangering their children, retirees claiming their medical devices had nearly failed because of his recklessness. The lawsuit had metastasized into a social conviction, a verdict handed down not by judges but by the collective fear of the community, and Julian felt the weight of every suspicious glance as though it were another stone in the wall being built around him. Yet, even as he was pushed to the margins, his resolve hardened, because in the quiet of his home, lit only by desk lamps over endless stacks of documents, he could see the outline of the conspiracy with greater clarity than ever. The anonymous emails had given him a weapon, but he needed corroboration, something irrefutable that could not be waved away as fabrication. Digging deeper into the records, he found references to contracts awarded to a small engineering firm, whose business address, when he searched it, turned out to be nothing more than a rented mailbox in a strip mall 2 towns over. Payments totaling nearly $500,000 had been funneled to this phantom company for maintenance on archived assets. The conclusion was inescapable. Brent had created a shell entity to launder funds, and the blackout was staged not only to justify those payments but to silence anyone who might question them. The breakthrough filled him with both triumph and terror, because while he now had enough to paint a picture of corruption, presenting it would mean confronting Brent directly in a forum she controlled, and he knew from experience that people, entrenched in power, fought hardest when cornered. His fears were confirmed when his attorney called to say that the HOA had scheduled a special hearing to address his pattern of disruptive conduct, a move clearly designed to frame him as unstable before he could introduce his evidence. The hearing was to be held in the community hall, a sterile room with white walls and fluorescent lights where the board had staged countless meetings. But this time the stakes were different. It would be a tribunal. A performance of authority meant to humiliate him publicly. On the night of the hearing, the hall was packed. Residents crammed shoulder to shoulder, murmuring in anticipation. Brent presided at the front, her calm smile radiating confidence, flanked by board members who looked less like neighbors and more like executives on a stage. When Julian was given the floor, he felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing against him. Yet he forced his voice steady, presenting copies of the emails and financial records, laying out the shell company scheme, the hidden hatch, the discrepancies in the outage timeline. He expected gasps, outrage, some sign of recognition, but instead the room remained eerily silent. And Brent, without missing a beat, dismissed his evidence as misinterpreted fragments stolen from confidential correspondence, and warned residents that Julian was attempting to destabilize the community for personal gain. Her words, smooth and rehearsed, drew nods from the crowd, and Julian realized with a sinking heart that logic alone would not save him. Not here, not in this hall where the narrative had already been written. And yet, even in defeat, there was a spark of victory, because as Brent spoke he saw one of the board members, An older man with tired eyes and a nervous twitch shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the emails Julian had spread across the table. Their eyes met briefly, and in that flicker of hesitation Julian sensed the possibility of fracture, the first crack in the facade of unity. It was not enough to win the night, but it was enough to confirm that the truth, though buried, still had power, and that his fight was far from over. When the case finally reached the courtroom, Julian felt the surreal weight of months of fear, doubt, and relentless harassment pressing down on him as he sat at the defendant's table beneath the unforgiving white lights, his folders of evidence. Neatly arranged, though his hands trembled slightly as he touched them, because no matter how carefully he had prepared, there remained the gnawing fear that the board's influence, their mastery of narrative and intimidation, would smother the truth, even here in the one place where it should matter most. The HOA arrived with an army of attorneys in polished suits, their binders stacked high, their demeanor calm and assured, as though victory were already a formality. Laura Brent sat with them, not in the shadows but at the forefront, her expression serene, her eyes occasionally drifting toward Julian with a hint of satisfaction, as if to remind him that she still believed she controlled the story. The proceedings began with the HOA's counsel painting a picture of Julian as reckless, bitter, and antagonistic, a man whose professional background made him uniquely dangerous because he possessed the technical knowledge to compromise the microgrid, a man who had previously questioned the board's authority and therefore had motive, and as each accusation rolled off their tongues, the room seemed to lean against him, every detail magnified, every insinuation polished to sound like truth. Julian forced himself to remain still, not to shake his head or show the anger boiling inside, because he knew his chance would come. When his attorney rose to speak, the tone shifted, calm but firm, presenting the evidence Julian had gathered, the financial anomalies, the payments to the shell company, the emails leaked from within the board. At first, the judge seemed unimpressed, accustomed perhaps to neighborhood squabbles wrapped in exaggerated language, but then the timeline was laid out, minute by minute, showing how the outage began at 8:13 while an internal message time-stamped at 7:54 referenced switching procedure initiated. That discrepancy hung in the air like a blade, and for the first time Brent's poise faltered, her hands tightening in her lap. Julian's attorney pressed the point, asking why no official emergency protocol had been filed with the County Utilities Department if this had been a genuine grid failure, why residents' money continued to flow to contractors whose offices did not exist, why maintenance reports carried signatures that, when examined closely, did not match Brent's official filings from prior years. Piece by piece, the scaffolding of the HOA's story began to collapse, and murmurs spread through the courtroom as residents who had come to watch shifted in their seats, the certainty of Julian's guilt dissolving into doubt. The breaking point came not from Julian's side but from within the board itself, when the older man with the nervous twitch called reluctantly to testify was pressed under oath about his knowledge of the hidden switch node. His voice cracked as he admitted that yes, the node still existed, that yes, it had been manually activated, and though he hesitated to assign blame directly, his admission was enough to detonate the facade Brent had constructed. Because in that moment, the blackout ceased to be a vague accident pinned on a convenient scapegoat and became a deliberate act carried out under the board's authority. Brent's attorneys scrambled to contain the damage, arguing technicalities, suggesting miscommunication, but the air in the room had shifted, the silence of the judge heavy with recognition that the case was no longer about one man's supposed recklessness but about systemic corruption hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. Julian sat frozen, hardly able to breathe as the judge finally spoke, declaring that the lawsuit against him was without merit, that the court would not only dismiss the charges but also refer the matter to the district attorney's office for investigation into possible fraud and criminal misconduct by the HOA leadership. The words struck like thunder, and for the first time in months Julian felt the suffocating weight lift from his chest, though it was not relief that filled him but something sharper, a grim vindication edged with exhaustion. Brent's face had gone pale, her composure crumbling as whispers spread through her own ranks, and for a fleeting second their eyes met across the room. Gone was the serene confidence. In its place flickered naked fear, the awareness that her control had slipped beyond retrieval. The gavel struck, echoing against the walls, sealing the decision, and Julian exhaled slowly, his body trembling with the enormity of what had just unfolded, knowing that though the battle was not yet over, though investigations and appeals and endless noise would follow, the truth had finally forced its way into the light, and with it the power of those who had tried to destroy him was beginning, at last, to shatter. In the weeks after the verdict, Julian found himself walking through Riverland with a strange sense of dislocation, because although the lawsuit had been dismissed and the judge's referral for criminal investigation had sent shockwaves through the community, daily life in the neighborhood seemed outwardly unchanged, lawns still trimmed, driveways still swept, the same polite nods exchanged in passing, yet beneath the surface the air had shifted, carrying an unease that could no longer be. Disguised with manicured hedges or HOA newsletters, Brent resigned within days, not with an admission of guilt but under the guise of personal reasons. And though her departure was framed as voluntary, everyone knew the weight of the investigation pressing down on her had made it inevitable. Other board members followed in quiet succession, some out of fear, others out of shame, and for a brief period the association seemed leaderless, staggering under the sudden vacuum of authority. Residents who had once whispered accusations at Julian now avoided his gaze altogether, as if acknowledging him meant acknowledging their own complicity in believing the lies spun about him, and he accepted their silence without bitterness, because vindication had never been about their approval, but about survival. The county's investigation widened, drawing in contractors, auditors, even city officials who had signed off on falsified reports, and though Julian was not formally part of the process, he received occasional calls from investigators asking him to clarify details or share the documents he had collected. Each time he obliged, feeling the strange weight of becoming not just a defendant but a reluctant witness to a larger unraveling. He declined every invitation to join the reformed HOA board, insisting that he had no desire to wield authority over his neighbors, and instead contented himself with the quiet work of repairing his home, replacing his slashed tires, repainting the scrawled words from his siding, and restoring a semblance of normalcy. Yet, even in this return to routine, he understood that nothing could truly go back to the way it had been, that the trust between residents and their governing body had been fractured beyond repair, and that his own place in Riverland would forever be defined by what had happened. On quiet evenings he sometimes walked to the wooded edge where the rusted hatch lay half buried, now sealed by the county with heavy bolts and a bright warning placard, and he would stand there in silence, reflecting on how a hidden piece of infrastructure had nearly destroyed his life, and how the arrogance of one leader's desire for control had turned a community against one of its own. Though the headlines faded and the legal machinery churned on at its slow pace, Julian carried the scars of the ordeal in subtle ways. The way he double-checked locks before bed, the way he scrutinized every official letter for hidden threats, the way he measured silence not as peace but as the calm before another storm. And yet, in spite of everything, he found a measure of strength in having endured, in knowing that when faced with a wall of lies he had chosen not to bend, and that choice, costly as it had been, had broken the narrative built against him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered to life, Julian replaced a bulb in the lamp-post outside his house with his own hands, not for the HOA, not for appearances, but simply because it mattered to him that the light remained steady, a small, stubborn act of ownership in a place where so much had once been stripped away.